Ren was a dryad planeswalker from an unknown world. Long ago, a fire ravaged her home glade, threatening all that she held dear. In an act of desperation, she trapped the flames inside herself, saving her people, but dooming Ren to contain them eternally. To survive, she needed to bond with a tree, but not any would do. It had to be strong enough to host not only her, but also the flames. Her first partner was one, who, after bonding with Ren, became a conscious treefolk and guided her throughout a profound partnership of exploration and discovery. Together, they became capable of not just traversing the lands, but even the spaces without, to walk between worlds. Unfortunately, their symbiosis was forced to an early end, as the fires within Ren would inevitably consume any tree she bonded with. Before such fate could befall one, Ren split from her and let her return to her peaceful self as a simple tree. Then came 2, 3, and so on, until Ren found Six on the dark plane of Innistrad. Six was an oak so strong and powerful, so mighty and wise, that he left an everlasting impression on Ren. Then, after a long journey of exploring the multiverse together, Six did the unthinkable. Even before he was endangered by Ren's flames, even while he was still strong enough to continue their journey, he asked to return home. Six could have stayed a treefolk and a planeswalker, but he chose not to. Together, they traveled back to Keswick, his home forest, found a clearing large enough for Six to plant roots, and then split apart, turning him back into the beautiful oak he was before. As she was leaving, Ren turned to Six one last time and promised that once 7 Viris, she'll return and seek out his sapling, and should it accept, then they would travel the multiverse together again. But unfortunately, Ren sacrificed herself during the Phyrexian invasion, as she bonded with the invasion tree Realmbreaker and used it to establish a connection with one of the few remaining bastions of reinforcements, Zalfir, bringing in Teferi and his forces to wipe out Phyrexia's leaders and then banish the entire plane of New Phyrexia into a planar tangle, phasing it out of existence. Ren saved the multiverse, but the strain of that selfless act was too much. The fire within Ren flared up and consumed her, leaving nothing behind but a statue of ash and a single acorn. Teferi then planted that acorn on Zalfir, which has since sprouted. While Ren and Six won't get another chance to travel together, maybe both their seedlings will one day find each other. Hi friends, this is a deck tech video for Six, one of my favorite commanders, who allows for a really intricate graveyard toolbox style of deck. Today I'm going to show you how to build an effective casual commander deck using Six as your commander. For this, I will present to you a deck list that was built with a €50 budget in mind, but always remember that the best budget decision for any deck you're building is to use cards that you already own. In that way, Six is perfect, because it doesn't demand many specific cards, and the few that I consider essential can also be used in a broad application of other decks. But before we get to any of that, I'm sorry, I know you didn't come here for the lore, but I'm gonna need to go on a short tangent. I included that little lore segment at the start, because I always think it makes for a more complete experience to know a bit about the commander you are playing. But as I was reading into it, I came to the conclusion that the card Six, as it is now, contradicts existing canon. I think the idea of the card was to depict Six without Ren. There's already a card called Ren and Six, so this is just Six. However, Ren doesn't bond with treefolk. She bonds with trees who become treefolk once they have joined with her, and that return to being trees once she leaves. So I'm not entirely sure what the card 6 actually depicts, as it appears to be 6 as a tree fork without Ren, and I think that's a lore mistake. Without Ren, 6 should just be a tree. Am I missing something here? Anyways, let's get to actually building a Magic the Gathering deck. 6 costs 3 mana to play and is a 2/4 with reach, which is actually a pretty good stat line, as he can attack freely during the early game. He says that whenever he attacks, you mill 3 cards and then you may put a land card from among the milled cards into your hand. He also gives non-land permanent cards in your graveyard retrace during your turn. Retrace allows you to play those cards by discarding a land in addition to paying their normal costs. Both these effects are quite strong and they fuel each other. Milling puts cards into our graveyard, which we can then retrace with the land we gained from the mill. However, it's too small of an engine to run the entire deck by itself, and so 6 still requires us to solve a few problems before we can really get started. While his inbuilt milling is great, it's not enough by itself to properly fill up the graveyard to create the toolbox that we are looking for. And while retracing is incredibly powerful, it requires us to have lands in hand. So when we are building this deck, we want to include additional effects to fill up our graveyard and ways to get lands into our hand. So let's start by adding 46 lands. I play 45 forests and a demolition field. I found that less than 45 lands is not enough to ensure that we get to draw one with 6 every time he attacks. And that's pretty important because every land in our hand lets us retrace a permanent, meaning they represent every permanent spell in our graveyard. So long as we milled enough cards, we are perfectly happy to have a hand full of lands. Now, you don't have to play specifically 45 forests. Feel free to add any variety of utility lands like War Room, Reliquary Tower, Scavenger Grounds, or if you have a higher power level playgroup, Nyktos, Shrine to Nyx. I would particularly recommend Disciple of Freyalise and Shifting Woodlands, as they both have strong synergies with the rest of our deck. But in this list, the only non-basic we play is Demolition Field, as it's the only land I consider an absolute necessity in nearly every deck. I'm not a particularly big fan of getting stonewalled by Field of the Dead or Glacial Chasm, and Demolition Field is a great way of dealing with those cards. Feel free to use whatever lands you have available. We have a lot of space for them in this deck. But also, don't feel pressured to add expensive utility lands. This deck plays perfectly fine with 46 forests. The only thing that really matters is that you don't add any tapped lands, as we want to play mana efficiently to maintain strong momentum. Since 6 only allows us to retrace permanents and only on our turn, this deck doesn't play much instant speed interaction. Instead, we're trying to build a permanent advantage through lands, card draw and board presence, and for that we need to be the ones keeping up the pressure. Our first step towards this goal is to get 6 out quickly. We play 7 Mana Dogs and an Elvish Spirit Guide to give us around a 73% chance to get 6 out on turn 2 if we mulligan once. Please feel free to replace the Elvish Spirit Guide, which is only here for budget reasons, with one of the 3 remaining Mana Dogs, Birds of Paradise, Boreal Druid or Delighted Halfling. At the start of the game, we always want to mulligan for our Mana Dogs. As crazy as it may sound, a starting hand consisting of 6 lands and a Mana Dog is totally fine, because it lets us get 6 out quickly and then we can start playing cards from our graveyard as he fills it up. But ideally we want a Mana Dog, 4 to 5 lands, and something to do on the following turns. One of the benefits of playing 46 lands is that we basically never have to worry about not getting enough of them in our opening hand, meaning we can go for a pretty aggressive mulligan just about every game. On turn 3 then, we want to attack, which gives us our first 6 trigger. Our best case scenario here is that we find 1 land, which we return to our hand, and then 2 permanents, which we place in our graveyard, giving us access to 3 playable cards. We can play the land immediately and retrace the permanents in our graveyard. While we are limited by how many lands we have in hand, more cards in our graveyard gives us more options at any given moment. But even if we don't get the perfect 6 mil, we usually hit at least 1 permanent and 1 land, which is plenty, especially if we get to do it repeatedly. From here, we have 2 main goals. First, we want to protect 6 so we can continue attacking. And second, we want to play other sources of self-mill to start building up our toolbox. We play a variety of 2 to 4 mana cards that serve those goals for this exact moment. Canopy Cover, Prowler's Helm, Swiftfoot Boots and Whisper Silk Cloak each protect 6 and hopefully enable him to attack every turn. If you already own some more expensive equipment like Hammer of Nazan, Mithril Coat or Commander's Blade, then they make for great replacements here. I think around 4 protection effects work perfectly fine, as by the time we want to play them, we should already have milled enough of our deck to find one. To properly mill ourselves, we want around 8 to 10 cards with strong self-mill effects. Aftermath Analyst, Cavalier of Thorns and World Shaper are particularly great because they double as both mill and ramp. This is also where we find 2 of our 4 non-permanent spells in the deck. Mulch and Winding Way both let us look at the top 4 cards of our deck and then draw all of the lands in there and discard the rest. Sometimes these 2 are just 2 mana, draw 4 cards, and other times they just fill up our graveyard with things we can play. However, they can't be played from the graveyard themselves, which is certainly a noteworthy downside, but I think their incredible effectiveness if we ever draw them naturally makes them a fine addition to the deck. Still, if you already own a bunch of other self-mill cards, then these 2 are the first to go. The third of our non-permanent spells is Splendid Reclamation, which is not only flavorful but also incredibly strong as it lets us return all lands from our graveyard to the battlefield. Bringing lands from our graveyard directly onto the battlefield is one of the strongest things we can do in this deck, because we are constantly milling cards, including lands, and we are discarding lands to play spells. We can very quickly accumulate a large number of lands in our graveyard, and if we find a way to return them into play, we're doubling down on their effectiveness. Ramunap Excavator lets us play the lands we discarded, freeing up the lands in our hand for more spells, while Arena's Gloomstalker and Scaretiller bring back additional lands as they attack. These supplement our stronger land return effects, Splendid Reclamation, Aftermath Analyst and World Shaper, which bring back all of our lands at once. I find it beneficial here to have a bit of a range of options. Aftermath Analyst is powerful, but also expensive and sometimes not worth it as we already brought back most of our lands. And World Shaper sometimes has a hard time dying. In those scenarios, Irenis is much more useful, as she's still a viable attacker even though she only returns a singular land. On the other hand, World Shaper can also be an excellent deterrent for board wipes and a great blocker. Keep in mind, this is a toolbox deck. We want a variety of effects so we can adjust to whichever fits the situation best. Around here is also where you can accomplish a lot by adding some more expensive options if you have access to them. Ancient Green Warden and Walking Closet are more fantastic ways to play lands from our graveyard, and Blossoming Tortoise, Head Shredder and Numra Bellow of the Woods mill us, return lands and our formidable long-term threats. This is where we find our most expensive inclusion and the final sorcery, Life from the Loam. Life from the Loam is probably the single most perfectly synergistic card in our deck. It's a sorcery that for 2 mana allows us to return up to 3 lands from our graveyard to our hand, and it has dredge free, which means that if we were to draw a card while Life from the Loam is in our graveyard, we can instead mill 3 cards and return Life from the Loam to our hand. This card does everything we want. When cast, it essentially draws us 3 cards, as we can use the lands we return to our hand to play any non-land permanent in our graveyard, and it's the only sorcery that doesn't mind being milled itself, as that means we can dredge it back to our hand, something we can then do every turn, which continues to fill up our graveyard and gives us more fuel. Life from the Loam is the sole reason why we play Elvish Visionary in our deck, because sometimes we want to play it multiple times in a turn, and Elvish Visionary is a cheap way to draw an additional card to dredge Life from the Loam again. Soul Guide Lantern and Kenra's Transformation serve a similar purpose, but it's nice to have some redundancy. I consider Life from the Loam the most powerful and essential card in this deck, but unfortunately it's a bit more expensive. However, it is also a card that can easily be transferred into other graveyard or lands-related shells. Same is true for 6 as well. You can just take both of those and slap them into any other deck that works similarly, and they will perform excellently. So even though they're a little bit more expensive, you can still safely buy them and you will always feel like you've got your money's worth. These cards make up the core essence of our game plan. Mill our deck to fill up our graveyard, to then play cards from the graveyard while returning the lands we used to do so. Along the way, we have to protect 6 and deal with various problems. For that, we play a suite of utility. Soulguide Lantern and Keen-Eyed Curator make for great graveyard hate. Reclamation Sage, Canker Plume, and Seal of Primordium let us deal with pesky enchantments or artifacts, and Kenris Transformation, Tree Shaker Chimera, and Thorn Mammoth can take care of some of the more dangerous creatures our opponents may play. If we are ever feeling extremely threatened, we can also set up a Spore Frog as a powerful defensive line while we're working towards our ultimate win condition. These are the cards that I like to use. But this part of the deck is entirely up to your own interpretation. Our list here plays around 16 pieces of general utility. Feel free to assemble your own toolbox, made up of cards that you enjoy and think are appropriate for your community. This is purely a creature-based combat deck. While 6 could certainly be used to set up instant win combo lines, I don't like playing those in casual commander decks. Instead, we're trying to do 2 things on our path to victory. We play a total of 5 effects that essentially double our mana and allow us to have explosive turns where we set up a board that will carry us to victory. Regal Behemoth also introduces the Monarchy, which is always a lot of fun. Gauntlet of Power and Caged Sun reward us for playing 45 forests and add a bit more power to the board. Zendikar Resurgent also doubles as card draw. And finally, the Filer of Vigor, which certainly stretches the definition of mana doubler a little bit, but still gives us a lot of resources to play with and can sometimes act as a game closer all by itself. If you own a Nyxbloom Ancient, I would recommend adding it in place of one of these, as it makes for an absolutely incredible powerhouse card. However, be aware that Nyxbloom Ancient will push the power level of this deck to a degree that the lines possible should only be played against other powerful decks. But if that's what you're looking for, add Spelunking. So long as we can get any of our mana engines to stick, then we should have enough resources to deal with the boards of our opponents by fighting them with Thorn Mammoth or distracting their blockers with Tree Shaker Chimera, and then trampling them to death with one of our 5 overrun effects. We play a bit of a range if it comes to these, with Loyal Guardian giving us a stronger long-term plan, while Thunderfoot Baloth and Fecund Greenshell act more as threatening board states rather than an immediate kill. And Rumbleweed is situational, varying between unplayably expensive and essentially free. We can pick and choose whichever makes the most sense for the given situation. Ultimately, we are happy to get any of them on the board to buff our team, and then we go for the kill with Endray's Forerunners. Endray's Forerunners are my preferred overrun because in addition to +2/+2 and Trample, they also give Vigilance, which keeps us ready for the backswing when we can't go for the immediate victory, and they are a huge body themselves. We can trample in while still being ready to defend ourselves. But of course, if you have the hoof, then probably play the hoof. You don't need it, but it would be incredibly powerful. All of this brings us to our final puzzle piece, the second essential card and the strongest utility in this deck, Springheart Nantuko. Springheart Nantuko is a creature that can be enchanted onto other creatures, and after doing so, whenever we have a land enter, we can make a copy of the enchanted creature by paying 2 mana. This allows for a near endless stream of powerful combinations. When enchanted onto a Cavalier of Thorns, we can then create a copy of the Cavalier, which triggers its enters the battlefield effect, letting us look at the top 5 cards, putting a land among them into play and the rest into the graveyard. This then triggers the Springheart Nantuko again, and if we have the mana for it, we can create another Cavalier of Thorns. By doing this a couple of times, we end up with a full graveyard and a bunch of extra lands in play on top of a board of 5-6 reaches. If we have a mana doubler in play, we can actually loop through our entire deck like this, because the lands from the Cavalier come into play untapped, which we can then use to pay for the Nantuko effect. Still, be careful. Even if we mill our entire deck, we still have to find a way to kill our opponents. But Springheart Nantuko can help with that too. We can enchant it onto a fecund green shell and then duplicate it, which triggers both green shells, letting us look at the top card of our deck, and if it's a land, put it into play tapped, and otherwise into our hand. If we hit a land this way, we can create another green shell, which gives us 3 more triggers, allowing us to continue. This pairing isn't quite as efficient as the one with Cavalier of Thorns, because the lands come into play tapped, but each fecund green shell will eventually give all of our creatures +2/+2, which can easily create an unbeatable board. Nantuko can also be enchanted onto Regal Behemoth to make our lands tap for 3, 4, 5, 6 times the normal mana. Once that's accomplished, we can even use the Seal of Primordium to destroy our own Springheart Nantuko to then recast it and attach it to Endray's Forerunners and duplicate them to overwhelm our opponents with a stampede of pigs. We can get the additional land drops we need by repeatedly playing Sakura Tribe Elder out of the graveyard and sacrificing it, and we can get the lands for that by playing Life from the Loam. If we have a ton of mana and lands in the graveyard, we can even play Aftermath Analyst and sacrifice it to get a bunch of landfall all at once. But important to keep in mind here is that nothing we do is infinite. We can quickly run out of mana, lands in hand, or even cards in our deck. We will always reach a limit to what we can do in a single turn, meaning we have to plan carefully. This may be a mono-green garbage pile, but it's a mono-green garbage pile that requires some thinking. We don't have a lot of instant speed interaction, and all of our removal is tied to permanence. While we have cards that can clear a board, like Fallen Mammoth and Tree Shaker Chimera, we need to find the right moments to use these effects. This complexity to our gameplay, I think, is wonderful and makes for a really engaging deck to play. Another thing I really love about it is how we can use our early game pieces freely, and then later we can also incorporate them in powerful game-winning turns. And even if our creatures get destroyed, we can just replay them out of our graveyard and keep going. But that's assuming they went to the graveyard. This deck has some clear weaknesses. First of all, we need Six. Without him, we can't do any graveyard shenanigans, and our card draw is limited. Protecting Six is important, which is why we play a bunch of protection effects, but those still require a turn to be set up. If Six gets immediately removed, then that can be a problem. But that's definitely unusual, as during the early game our opponents are going to be busy setting up their own mana and engines. The bigger problems start happening later, once board wipes and graveyard hate start coming. Targeted graveyard hate isn't actually that much of a problem, because when we retrace spells from our graveyard, they can't be removed in response. Unlike, let's say, Reanimate, retracing doesn't create a separate trigger or require a target, and instead immediately places our spell on the stack, meaning cards like Scavenging Ooze can't respond to it. And if your community plays a ton of those cards, then you can also always slot in a ground seal to shut them down. However, graveyard hate that targets our entire graveyard sucks. There just isn't much we can do about it. Our main strategy if it comes to that is to be quick with getting our lands out of the graveyard before they are exiled. That way we at least have access to a bunch of resources as we begin rebuilding. But if somebody starts the game with a Leyline of the Void in play, then we just pack it up. Honestly, it's game over. Board wipes on the other hand, they can be fine. We can just play our stuff out of the graveyard again. That's as long as the board wipes aren't exile-based, like Sculpted Sunburst or Farewell. In those scenarios, we are in a lot more trouble. But even in the worst case scenario, which is getting everything exiled by Farewell, we can always pivot into just playing cards from our hand. At the end of the day, we don't have to do graveyard stuff. This is still a deck full of nice, powerful green creatures that we can just play out regularly and use to attack people. There are a bunch of cards that we have that can help us in those emergencies to re-establish ourselves and return to our primary game plan. Garruk's Uprising and Oakham Adversary offer important card draw, and Mana Gorger Hydra is a game-ending threat all by itself. Perpetual Timepiece can also be used in response to Graveyard Hate to bring our graveyard back into our deck. While we still have to start over our milling process, at least we haven't lost everything permanently. Despite our weaknesses, because we put such heavy emphasis on building a land-based advantage, this deck is actually quite resilient. I also think it's a ton of fun to play. We always have a lot of options available while being proactive with a variety of game plans. We can beat a problem, duplicating Mana Gorger Hydras early on, or we can chill and play for economy. There's always a next step to take, and it's basically impossible to get mana flooded or screwed. 6 also has this beautiful portrait art that I think makes for a fantastic look on a commander. I designed this list to be a casual deck, but if you want to build this deck yourself and push the power level, then there are quite a few additions you could make. I didn't build this as a landfall deck, but you could if you wanted to, and adding the usual landfall package would certainly lead to powerful board states quickly. Oran Frostfang can also offer some additional card draw and makes it less likely that our opponents block 6 while we are attacking for value. It also works very well with a Trample Overrun, letting us push for more damage. Ren and 7 are both flavorful and good to include, offering additional card draw and general utility. I also wouldn't blame you if you wanted to include some of the more generic instant speed interaction like Beast Within and Fog. Crop rotation is always amazing, especially if you play some stronger utility cards like Talon Gates of Madara, and some additional graveyard filling effects like Greater Good and Altar of Dementia, in particular in combination with Galta Primal Hunger, can really speed up our game plan, especially since they offer a sacrifice outlet to make some of our currently limited combos properly infinite. Spelunking and Surin Orb are also noteworthy for that same effect. If you're approaching CEDH, which I don't think 6 is particularly good for because we don't have much instant speed interaction and we can't really stop combos from happening, then you can add fast mana like Soul Ring and fully lean into the combo style, but I'm gonna leave that up to you to figure out. The best thing about 6 is that he makes for a great home for any mono-green garbage monsters you got lying around. It doesn't have to be specifically designed, you can just take anything you got and toss it into a shell with 6 and it will perform excellently. That's what my first version of the deck was, and it was a lot of fun to play even back then. But of course, 6 becomes a lot more powerful once you give him some support like we did today. The list we went through today was also designed to include a lot of cards that can easily be reused in different decks, and was limited to a €50 budget like I mentioned at the beginning. Although, of course, that doesn't include shipping. I ended up paying around €75 when I ordered all of the cards. But you can easily substitute most of the cards in the deck with similar ones you already own. Don't feel like you have to use my exact list, which, by the way, you can find in the description. And if you don't own any of the cards and you aren't sure about investing into this deck, always keep in mind that printing an entire deck at a copy shop will cost you about $3 and give you wonderful cards to playtest with, which is something that Wizards of the Coast have a standing article on their website that clearly states that this is fine and permitted to do. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. As I already mentioned, I actually went and I bought this entire deck. I've got it right here, and I've taken this to my local community and I've played it there. And it's always a lot of fun because it's an incredibly fair deck. Everything that we do is open on the table. People can see it, people can interact with it, people can prepare for it. But it's also very exciting because we get to do some very powerful things, and that's always just cool. I like that. I think it's fun. Now, if you want to see this deck in action, we can do that too. And we will be doing that on our Community Friday streams. I need a better name for that. Please leave your suggestions in the comments. But basically every Friday I want to stream on this channel, on the YouTube channel right here. And we're going to be playing Commander together. We're going to be playing Commander via Spell Table, just hanging out in Discord and always getting new people in there. I want to give as many of you an opportunity to play as possible. We already did one of these streams and it was a lot of fun, although I still need to figure out a couple of details as to like production, but we'll get that right. We're working on that. But yeah, please feel free to join those. Every Friday is when we're going to be doing that with maybe an exception here and there, depending on how often I can make it happen, but I will let you know ahead of time. We will also vary up the time slots a little bit so that everybody gets a chance to play, but again, I will let you know about those ahead of time. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you guys are interested in seeing this 6-stack in action. And actually, I'm gonna need to figure out what I do with this now, because I now have 2 6-stacks. Are any of you interested, maybe? Like I built a second one so I could test this one, but you know, maybe we'll auction this one off. That seems fun. That seems like something we can do on stream. So yeah, anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.